Well, we'll start by introducing ourselves, and then you'll introduce yourselves. Then we'll ask the question, and everybody's going to have a great day, right? Okay, fantastic. I'll start again. My name is Will Holt. I've been a part of this program for a long time, not as long as some of the teachers here, but for a long time. I actually am an alumnus of the program, 1999, from Reed High School, state champions that year. Very good stuff. But back then, for our, what we call the district, which is now the regional, we only competed against Sparks High School. And then for our state competition, we only competed against Basic High School out of Henderson, Las Vegas. One school, that was it. Okay. Are you better than the other school? We don't know yet. Let's go and duke it out in the arena. Now, professionally, I am a nonprofit consultant. I help with like donation forms and websites and things like that in my day job. It's a company called Blackbaud. And anybody ever heard of the Susan G. Komen Walk for the Cure? Some people have. Well, that's my company software. I show nonprofits how to use it all day long. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague before I talk too much.
Thanks for starting us off. My name is Abigail. I work at the U.S. District Court. I'm an attorney. I'm originally from Colorado. I graduated from Georgetown Law a couple years ago. I'm so impressed by everyone. I can't imagine doing this in high school. And thanks for all your hard work, and excited to be here today.
Hi everyone, Trustee Colleen Westlake. I represent District B on the school board, and I'm a huge advocate for the betterment and support of our students, and in that way we build a stronger community. And I'm very happy to be here today. I think We the People is an amazing program for our kids. Thank you.
Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
My name is Jackson Lucky.
My name is Mars Trimble.
I'm Michael Terrazas.
My name is Silas Cruz. We are Unit 2, and these are our teachers, Ms. Karsten and Mr. Sowell.
Thank you so much. All right, so now we got to get down to business, unfortunately, but this is why we're all here. So what we're going to do is ask a question, and here it comes. Unit 2, how did the framers create the Constitution? Go. I'm just kidding. One critic of the Constitution noted that, like the wooden horse filled with soldiers in ancient times, the Constitution would be destructive to the liberties Americans enjoyed. What features of the Constitution might this author have had in mind that would threaten Americans' liberties? In your opinion, would a second convention have reduced the anti-federalist concerns over the Constitution? Why or why not? And when examining American history, to what extent were the anti-federalist criticisms legitimate? You may begin when you are ready.
Under the pseudonym Sentinel, Samuel Bryan voiced his concerns that the proposed Constitution's vague stance on taxation and intense presidential powers would threaten Americans' liberties. He worried that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1's vagueness would allow for similar situations to the Stamp Act of 1765, where the British had imposed an unfair tax on American colonies and stripped citizens of their property. The lack of a limit on presidential terms presented by Article 2 may have allowed for one to become what Patrick Henry called an elected king.
With the power to make treaties and appoint judges to the Supreme Court, as outlined by Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, corruption in the presidential position could be detrimental to our liberties. The Declaration of Independence's right of the people to alter or abolish tyrannical governments could be crushed by a vote-standing federal army that is loyal to a corrupt president and Senate.
A second convention may have reduced the concerns of the anti-federalists regarding issues such as the Bill of Rights and representation in Congress. Edmund Randolph said a second convention would give contentment to many who are now dissatisfied over the protection of rights. George Mason refused to sign the Constitution, partly because it lacked a Bill of Rights. He said only a second convention could solve the problem.
Elbridge Gerry refused to sign, citing several problems with the Constitution. Historian Pauline Maier wrote, like Mason and Randolph, only a second convention could possibly resolve Gerry's concerns over Congress.
Legitimate anti-federalist criticisms include Congress's powers to tax and borrow, lack of congressional term limits, and the growth of presidential power. James Madison argued in Federalist 41 that Congress's power to tax for the general welfare applied only to specific powers enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. But in 1936, U.S. v. Butler legitimized anti-federalist fears by ruling that the general welfare is whatever Congress determines. Congress has now used its expanded powers to create a multitude of federal programs outside of the scope of Article 1, Section 8, and incur over $38 trillion in debt, and asserting power over the states with money. This is known as fiscal federalism.
Anti-Federalist John Hancock proposed amendments limiting the length and number of congressional terms. A Pew Research study in 2024 found 87% of people supporting congressional term limits. The length of time in office has continued to increase over the last 100 years, and incumbents are re-elected 95% of the time. A common anti-federalist sentiment was, quote, "When annual elections end, tyranny begins," unquote. George Clinton in Cato 5 argued that members of Congress ought to only have one term for 1 year.
Historian Carol Berkin wrote, "If the convention delegates were magically transported to America today, they would be puzzled by our unspoken assumption that the president, rather than Congress, was expected to set our agenda in every aspect of domestic and foreign affairs. Today, presidents issue expansive executive actions and orders. President Obama on immigration, President Biden for giving student loan debt and mandating vaccines, and President Trump creating crime-fighting National Guard units to send to cities, and usurping Congress's taxing power with countless tariffs."
Thank you.
All right. Let's start off with an easy one. What checks can each branch take to counter tyranny in another branch of government?
One of the biggest checks that the judicial branch in of itself is a check on the other branches. In the Administrative Procedure Act of 1948, the judicial branch, not necessarily checks, but compensated for failures on the legislator's part by saying that in cases where legislation is ambiguous, it is the job of the it is the job of the judiciary to decide it. However, the judiciary then wrongly gave this power away to the executive branch in the Chevron deference. Later on, the judicial branch was able to check the executive branch in a way, also retroactively check itself by taking this power back in the Loper-Bright decision.
The congressional branch is also able to put checks on the executive branch by overriding his vetoes. In Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, it states that with a 2/3 majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, presidential vetoes would not be taken into account and the law was still passed.
States can also check the president because due to sue court cases such as Minnesota v. Trump, we see the state of Minnesota suing President Trump over things such as the right of trans athletes to compete in women's sports.
All right, so you guys hit on, and it highlighted an important tension between the separation of powers between the federal government and the states. And, you know, I am very interested in this question of central versus dispersed power. For example, on Thursday, just this past week, President Trump passed an executive order essentially invalidating any AI laws passed by the states. What do you think about this, and how would you tie this current event to constitutional provisions you cited in your opening today?
I believe that this is unconstitutional because it does not say in the Constitution whether or not the Congress has, or the federal government, has the power to take this right away from the states. In fact, any powers that are not enumerated in the Constitution as of Amendment 10 are given to the states.
I think that this decision, like my colleague said, is an overstep of this bounds because as Justice Brandeis said in his decision, The states need to act as laboratories of democracy so that we can experiment and see how AI laws will affect people, so that once a time comes, we can create a federal rule that is needed.
This is also very problematic just in general terms because it's destroying any separation of powers between the three branches in Articles 1, 2, and 3. The French philosopher Montesquieu said in his book, The Spirit of Laws, that it's essential to keep, that we prohibit even two branches from connecting with each other because it will result in a government that is oppressive, arbitrary, violent, or all three. What we see here, however, is that the executive branch is not only essentially making laws, which is the job of the legislative branch, but in trying to deal with laws that already exist for the president for making laws that exist, it's also overstepping the boundaries into the judicial branch.
Do you think the founders or authors of the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers considered the impact of political parties on separation of powers? Did their argument turn out to be correct or incorrect, and how?
Yes, the Federalist Papers did address the idea of having parties, but stated that the broad size of America would naturally fight against that. James Madison said in Federalist 10 that the idea was because we were such a diverse group that the factions would not be able to coalesce into supermajorities, and that even in those factions there would be groups attempting to work against each other, and that would keep us from moving in one direction solely.
This idea is also shown in Federal Farmer 2, where he stated that he had concerns that a strong federal government would overpower and not listen to smaller governments and issues in communities.
To answer the second part of your question, yes, they were in large, so both, as my partners have already said, yes, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists did discuss the issues of parties and specifically factions, and they were correct in a lot of ways, but there were some unforeseen side effects. For example, James Madison in Federalist 10 says that we need diverse competing interests so that factions will be forced to compromise. Well, we see diverse competing interests were the cause of the recent government shutdown. And in the end, and it did end due to a compromise between the two factions. However, what they didn't necessarily allow for is the fact that there were a ton of federal programs that were suspended during the government shutdown, only because of the 10th Amendment and the ability of states to step in and pass bills like SB 3 to create the Silver State General Welfare Fund. Are we able to properly survive giant shutdowns like the government shutdown?
On the other hand, anti-federalist Robert Yates in Brutus I wrote that a large republic would have these diverse competing interests, and that would stop them from creating a more perfect union. But in a small republic with one leader, that leader can check everybody because it's a small homogeneous community with the same ideals for a perfect union.
So, if a constitutional convention were held today, what changes do you think that we should make to alter, or do you think we should abolish it, or alter the form and shape of government and its distribution of power? And what amendments do you think could be proposed at this convention?
I think that currently we need to put more checks on the congressional branch. Citizens United, the FEC, has allowed corporations to enjoy the protections of individuals in the political space and use money to influence our politicians. I think that by overturning that with an amendment at a second convention under Article 5, it would allow us to keep them representing us.
I believe that we should have an amendment stating that the president has to have executive orders checked by the next two branches, the legislative and the judicial, all because the president can make executive orders which alter the state of our society or the United States in general.
Section 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN already says that people have a right to food, to water, and the necessities of life. I think that this is something that would be incorporated in another constitutional convention, and in many ways we already see states trying to take the lead on issues like this. That's why in the recent Nevada Special Legislative Session, we passed Bill SB 6, using state funds to relocate the residents of Windsor Park, Las Vegas.
Additionally, the mayoral election in New York moved towards a more socialist candidate in Zohran Mamdani, who is focusing on affordability of houses by freezing rent and access to food and water through government subsidized grocery stores.
All super interesting questions, or points, I'm sorry. I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you guys spoke to as far as checking the executive power. There are several powers vested in the executive, specifically the president, commander-in-chief, for example, from a military perspective. Are there additional powers of the executive that you would check or like to see checked through the addition of a new amendment?
Under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 3, it simply states that the president shall take care that laws are faithfully executed. I think that this is painfully vague, and that if we were to amend it to list certain things, as Article 1, Section 8 does for Congress, we can see that we would find more peace.
Okay, I think you had an overabundance of evidence. Usually that's always the problem. So I think that you demonstrated that you definitely have a solid grasp of the subject matter, and I thank you for that. I think where you could probably get a little bit stronger here, as far as a suggestion, if you make it onto that next level, might be like considering more about ways in which power in the government can be abused by anyone, and who could abuse it, right? What are the conditions that are present for that to happen, and how would you counter that? I think thinking through those, just kind of like doing just a thought exercise around that, brainstorming. You know, for instance, the political parties question, I might have said, they didn't foresee that all three branches could be captured by a single party. Or if they did, that they would act in unison to subvert the chances of the other party or any other opposition from gaining that power back in some way, right? Like that could be an example of just using today's, like, if you believe in what's happening at the federal level, like, is Congress just willingly giving over its power? Can that still happen? Should they be able to do that, or should the court step in and intervene saying, you can't give that power away, sorry, it's yours? So would that then return the war powers back to Congress, because there's the War Powers Act? Would that then change the tariffs back to Congress, because tariffs belong with the power of the purse, right? So what are ways in which, the founders probably didn't see it, but what are ways that we're dealing with now that are considered challenges that could potentially precipitate, you probably have heard this word, or this phrase, constitutional crisis. So I might consider all of those really, when in this context, beyond just what the Anti-Federalists are arguing. I might even go back to the Anti-Federalists and say, okay, well, why did they ask for all these different Bill of Rights? Did they get everything that they wanted? And if we were a part of the Anti-Federalists today, what else would we want? You know, would I want, for instance, term limits? Would I want, you know, maybe it could be like better clarification on birthright citizenship, which is being currently discussed in front of the Supreme Court right now. Like, right now, they're not questioning whether or not you're born on the soil. What they're questioning is the jurisdiction thereof part of it. What does that mean? What is the context of that? And, you know, is that something that should be a power that could be taken away from somebody who's born on the soil, right? because the sovereign are, the people are where power is derived in government right now in our country. So what are ways in which power is being taken away from the people? Definitely consider all that before your next showing, if you end up showing at the next level. And definitely a great job. You guys have a great command over the subject matter. I think it was very well done.
I thought you guys did an amazing job. I really appreciated your application of constitutional principles and knowledge to current events. You didn't only know the relevant provisions, but you knew what was going on in the world clearly too, which I thought was incredibly impressive. The fact that you spoke to, I know my AI law question was very targeted and specific and just happened on Thursday. But the fact that you knew there wasn't like broader omnibus federal legislation in place related to AI was very impressive. And just being able to kind of navigate that back and forth of like then versus now and current events and where are we at today. So I love that, and I'm super impressed, so great job.
I thought your passion and delivery was amazing. I mean, really, I could tell you all felt very comfortable in the positions and arguments you made. And I love that you touched on it a little bit, the accountability of the branches to ensure that individuals have resources to sustain life, water, food. And I think maybe just fleshing that out just a little bit on what the government is there to do. They're there to be accountable to us, and the only way we can ensure that is the checks and balances, which I think you guys really were covering that very well. So I thought you guys did amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. One last hand.
Great job.
Thank you.
Very proud of you.
Thank you so much.
Great work.
Very proud of you.
Great work.
Really good job. Very proud.
Great work.